morning, our reading from God's Word this morning is Philippians 1, verses 12 through 18. You'll find that on page 921 in your P Bible. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to inflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. Let's all repeat that last phrase. Yes, I will rejoice.
Thank you, Jim. You can maybe be seated. I knew it was dangerous to have Jim read that passage. He's such a joyful person. It's the perfect one to read it. Thank you, Jim. In 1993, in his inaugural address for President of the United States, Bill Clinton quoted from a specific author. He read this: "For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." 30 years earlier, Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech, quoted from the same author. Actually, this isn't a quote. He alluded to a passage in his speech, and this is the passage that he alluded to from the same author. "There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And then 50-some years later after that, Hillary Clinton, in her concession speech to Donald Trump after losing the presidential election, quoted from the same author, and she read this: "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." This particular author that was quoted in each of these kind of famous speeches by a public figure is an author who's quoted all the time. Quoted in wedding after wedding after wedding after wedding, in every town, just about every city, just about every country, all around the world for centuries. This same author is often quoted. I've quoted from this author in weddings before, and a line that is often quoted in weddings from this author is this: "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Now, what is remarkable is not simply that this particular author has had such a cultural impact. What's remarkable is not simply that this author is so often quoted, but perhaps what is even more remarkable, as we will see, is the situation this author happened to be in when they penned these various words. Today we're continuing in our series called Finding Joy. We as a species are good at finding a lot of things. We're good, for example, at finding energy, finding ways to get energy. We have found that if you drill through the Earth's surface, you can pull up this substance that you can use to make energy. So we're good at finding ways to bring energy. We found ways to get energy just by literally getting the sun rays out of the sky and harnessing them into energy. We are finding ways to bring energy through splitting atoms and fusing atoms. And in my home state of Wyoming, there are windmills everywhere. We are finding ways to harness energy. We're good at finding ways to do a lot of things. But we're not very good at finding ways to have joy. We're not good at finding joy. I cited a study from Boston University that came out recently. I cited this last week that says that in the last 2 years, 33% of Americans have suffered from some form of depression, have had some sort of depressive symptoms. That's 1 out of every 3 people. I had you all make eye contact last week with at least 3 people in the room, and I said, if you did that, that at least one of those individuals, statistically speaking, probably suffered from some form of depression in the last couple of years. And we know that a big part of that is the pandemic, but I think it still points to something fundamental about us as people, and that is that we are not very good at finding joy. So we are doing a 9-week series, which we started last week, a 9-week series called Finding Joy. We want to explore how can we find joy. So again, I want to encourage you to invite your friends. We want to fill the pews with sad people so that together we sad people can find joy. And what we're doing to find joy is we're looking at the book of Philippians. We're looking at this letter written by a man named Paul, written in the 1st century A.D., written to a faith community in the city of Philippi. And the reason why we're using this particular letter is because it is dripping with joy. If you were to tear the pages of Philippians out of your Bible, I don't encourage you to do that, but if you were to tear them out, and if you were to wring them out like you would wring out a wet rag, do you know what would drip out of those pages? Joy. Joy would drip out of those pages. And we see it in this passage as Jim so eloquently read for us this morning. We see it in the passage that was just read. Let me read this one quote. What then, only, this is verse 18, what then, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. This letter is dripping with joy. Now, the question, of course, is, the million-dollar question is, why is Paul so joyful? Why is this letter dripping with joy? And of course, that was the subject of last week's message. And the answer is because of Easter. Paul is joyful because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. The death and the resurrection of Jesus are what provide for us the 2 things that we need most in our lives if we're going to be joyful, and that is grace and peace. Grace, God loves us, God validates us, not on the basis of anything that we do, but simply because He loves us. I said last week that nothing sucks the joy out of your life quite like the constant need for validation. And the grace of God deals with our need for validation. We see that nothing quite sucks the joy out of our life like fear about the future and regret about what has happened in our past. But the peace of God, rooted in the resurrection of Jesus, is that there is no opportunity that is ever truly lost. Nothing is ever truly lost. Nothing is ever truly missed, because in the resurrection of Jesus, we see what God is going to do. God is going to renew and restore all of creation, and all who put their faith in Him will ultimately one day be renewed in the image of God, renewed to be the very person that they were created to be, and live eternally in pursuit of that vocation, eternally in pursuit of what it is that God created them to be. Peace. And grace was when you have peace and when you have grace, you have joy. And it's that joy then that spills out into every other area of our lives. Now, one observation I want to make before we move on here, I was going to make this observation last week, but I was going to take up too much time. So I'm going to make it today. When we talk about this joy that is available because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, what we need to realize is that it's not a joy that is found simply through looking at the world differently. Okay? It's not simply a matter of looking at the world differently. Some people think that the key to joy is sort of, mind over matter, right? You just need to look at the world differently. just try to see it from a different perspective, as if that itself is what's going to bring joy. But what's so unique about the Christian faith, actually, is that it's not simply that we put on a lens that allows us to now see the world differently. Here's the truth. It's not a matter of looking at the world differently, but understanding that the world itself is different. That because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the world itself is different. So I can't remember if I put this in there. Do we have that picture again? Yeah, we did. Okay. I showed you all this picture last week. This is a picture of fans, university fans from the University of Kansas. And this picture is taken literally moments after their men's basketball team won the national basketball championship 2 weeks ago. And we said, what is this? What's on their faces? That is the joy of victory. That's the joy of victory right there. Now, you think about this. Now, Kansas, they played another team, North Carolina. And I want you to imagine here for a moment how they might have been feeling, especially the basketball team, right? And usually what happens after a basketball game, I don't have a picture of their sad faces, but you can imagine they're probably pretty sad. But after games like this, the teams, they go back into their locker rooms, right? And the coach, especially the coach of the losing team, he's got to go in there and give some sort of speech, right? And so you can imagine the coach of North Carolina. He goes in there, I don't know what he said, but I'm imagining he went in there, and what did he do? He tried to cheer them up, right? And so he probably said something like, "Oh, hey guys, this is a life lesson for you, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," or something like that, or hey, look on the bright side, you made it to the national championship, and nobody can ever take that away from you. You can lift your heads up. In other words, what's he doing? He's trying to get them to look at the world differently as a way of bringing joy into their lives. But imagine what the coach for Kansas had to say in the locker room. He didn't have to say anything because their world was different. Their world had changed, and so because their world had changed, they saw the world differently. But it wasn't simply a matter of perspective. And the same thing is true for Christians. It's not simply a matter of trying to look through some lens. It's realizing that in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the world is different. And the more you come to understand that, the more you come to experience joy. And so what we're doing is we're seeing that this joy that flows out of the death and resurrection of Jesus, it spills out into every area of our lives. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at different ways in which joy kind of emerges in our lives. We did an Easter egg hunt last Saturday, week ago Saturday, and the kids, so they'd go out around the church grounds, and they would find an Easter egg, and they would open up that egg, and joy. There's joy in those Easter eggs, right? Okay, so what we're kind of doing now is we're doing our own little Easter egg hunt for these 9 weeks. And each week we're going to be opening up a new egg, and we're going to find a new way in which joy is available because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And we're doing this based on the book of Philippians. And so what we're doing is today I want to open up another egg from the passage that was just read. And here's what I think we find in that passage of Philippians. It's this. We can find joy knowing that God uses the bad to bring about the good. We can find joy knowing that God uses the bad to bring about the good. Right, so the situation that Paul is in as he writes this letter, here's what we need to kind of set the context here a little bit. Things are not going well for Paul. It's bad. A lot of bad stuff has been happening to Paul. First of all, Paul is in prison, okay? Think about this. This letter that is dripping with joy was written from prison, okay? So things aren't going well. He's in prison. I mean, look, going to prison for anybody is usually not a good thing. But Paul, especially as an itinerant minister, in other words, his vocation, his sense of calling was to go out and to try to meet as many people as he could and proclaim the message of the Christian faith to as many people as he possibly could, and he's in prison, right? So that's doubly bad. I mean, like for an itinerant minister to be thrown in prison would be like a food critic getting COVID. You know what I mean? I mean, like it's bad if anybody gets COVID. It's no fun if anybody loses their sense of taste and smell. But if you're a food critic, I mean, now this is a double whammy for you. And that's what it's like for Paul as an itinerant minister being thrown in prison. It's like a food critic getting COVID. It's like a high jumper blowing out their knee, right? I mean, it's bad if anybody blows out their knee. But if you're a high jumper, it's doubly bad. So this is just bad for Paul. An itinerant minister, he's been thrown in prison. There's a second bad thing that's going on for Paul here that emerges in this text. And that is that it seems like there are people on the outside who are stirring up trouble for him. And this emerges here in verses 15 through 17. It says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment." Now, there's a substantial amount of scholarly debate as far as to who these folks are that are stirring up trouble. And the translation that we read here definitely reflects a particular view, and it's the most common view, and that is that the people stirring up trouble are fellow Christians who, for whatever reason, have it in for Paul. Maybe they're jealous of the following that he has. A lot of different theories on this. And so they're going around proclaiming the gospel, and they almost see it as an opportunity to draw attention to themselves. But what they know is that preaching the gospel is actually only going to get Paul more in trouble, because the reason he's in prison is because he's been proclaiming this religious faith that the Romans are becoming increasingly suspicious of. And so the more the word gets out there, then it's less likely that they're going to let him out of prison. And so it seems like some of these Christians who are jealous of him, just are kind of happy that it's keeping him in prison. That's one theory. Another theory, which is not really reflected in this translation, but the Greek does allow for a different way of understanding what's going on here, is that actually the people that are proclaiming the gospel or sharing the gospel, they're actually non-Christians who have just heard this crazy story. They've just heard this crazy story. Like, hey, did you hear about this guy? He's in prison for saying that the Messiah came back and that he died and rose from the grave. I mean, it's crazy. Almost like somebody on Facebook just spreading a controversial story just because it's kind of fun. But in either way, whatever the reason is, it's stirring up trouble, and it's making it less likely that Paul is going to be released from prison. So it's doubly bad. He's got these two bad things going on. But here's what Paul realizes: that view is only one part of the story. Paul realizes there's a bigger story to this, and he's writing to the church in Philippi, this faith community that loves him, and all they know is, oh my gosh, Paul's in prison, and people are stirring up trouble for him, and they're worried about him, and he wants them to know, wait a minute, there's more to it than that. That's not the whole story. Paul realizes that there is good. God is using the bad to bring about good. And the good that's coming from this, he's like, first of all, the gospel is being proclaimed. The reality of the death and resurrection of Jesus it's spreading. And who cares why they're spreading it? Who cares what their motivation is? I don't care. I'm just happy God's using that. Whatever their motivation is, he's using it to spread the reality of the gospel. And that's a good thing. He's taking the bad and he's using it for good. Secondly, he's like, look, I realize being an itinerant minister, being in prison doesn't seem like a very good place to be, but wait a minute. It's given me the opportunity to engage with the prison guards, and that actually, he's like, wait a minute, this is a constituency that I might not have been able to reach, but I actually have this opportunity. They're hearing of the gospel because I'm here, and strategically, I think Paul realizes that might actually be a good thing. Of course, subsequent history would vindicate that. We look at Constantine, the emperor, when he became Christian, it actually allowed the gospel to spread more freely. So Paul sees in this an opportunity. Paul sees that God is using the bad to bring about good. And of course, that's nothing new. That's nothing new in the story of the people of God. As the Bible records it, God is constantly taking the bad and bringing good out of it. Of course, a famous story is the story of Joseph. in the Old Testament we find in the book of Genesis. And Joseph, similarly, oh, there it is again. I love this. For some reason, when we read the Bible, music plays. It's just beautiful. I don't know why it's doing that, but it's just, it elevates my spirits. We're not quite ready for the passage yet anyway. Anyway, so Joseph, two bad things have happened to Joseph. And honestly, if either one of these things happened to you, you'd be like, where is God? I mean, literally, the two things that happened to him, most of us, when we go through life, as bad stuff happens, nothing as bad as what happens in either one of these situations ever happens to most of us. Now, some of us, that's not true. But for most of us, really, look at this. This is what happens to him. First of all, he gets sold into slavery by his brothers. I mean, it's the game over. Like, that happens to you in your life? Really? He gets sold into slavery by his brothers. It's pretty bad. But it gets worse, because then his slave master, the wife of his slave master, falsely accuses him of sexual assault, and he gets thrown in prison. Both those things happen to him. But of course, what happens? God uses the bad to bring about good. He uses his imprisonment for good. Sound familiar? He uses imprisonment. While Joseph is in prison, he's brought into contact with somebody who, to make a long story short, gets him in contact with the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. And so then he ends up rising to power. He becomes the most powerful person in Egypt other than the Pharaoh himself. And then a famine comes over the land, and his brothers and his father come to Egypt looking for help. And because of all of those bad things that happened, he's able to help them out. And so in this famous passage in Genesis chapter 50, when he sees his brothers, this is what he says to them. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Friends, we can rejoice knowing that God uses the bad to bring about good. And of course, I think there's an important implication here we need to draw out from this. And that's this. This is what this sort of demonstrates, I think. God is really, 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 really in control. I can't remember how many reallys I put. It was 4, okay. God is really, 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 really in control. Like, I'm not sure we really get just how, we say, oh, God's in control, but I'm not sure we get just how in control God really is. So my daughter, my 9-year-old, she is learning to play the Star Wars theme song on the piano, which is really sweet because she's learning it because her brother, Caleb, loves Star Wars, so she wants to be able to play it for him. Isn't that sweet? So let's talk about Star Wars here for a minute. Okay. Star Wars, episodes 4, 5, and 6, the first original series, those 3. One of the main subplots of episodes 4, 5, and 6 is the story of Luke Skywalker. And it's the story of him training to become a Jedi Knight. Now, a Jedi Knight, when you're training to become a Jedi, what is it that you're actually training to be able to do? You're training to be able to control things. It's all about having more and more control over the world, more and more control over the universe. I mean, you've heard the expression, like somebody walks into a room and you're like, oh my gosh, when they walked into the room, man, they just took control of the room. You've heard like that. Okay, that, like with a Jedi Knight, that's literally true. I mean, they literally take control of the room. And so you see like the legit Jedi Knights, Kylo Ren, like there's one in the later movies where somebody fires a laser at him and he just tells the laser to stop. And he just freezes it there. And it just kind of sits there. And then a little bit later, he decides to let the laser, he releases it and the laser continues, right? Just control. And Yoda, he's able to just kind of elevate an X-Wing fighter out of a swamp in Dagobah, right? You guys all remember this. And Snoke, he's able to like just drag General Hux across the floor just by willing it into existence. Okay, this is just control over the universe. And I think that some of us think, okay, that's the kind of control that God has, right? God has the control of a Luke Skywalker, right? He's got that kind of Jedi Knight control. Folks, no. God has the control of George Lucas. That's the control he has. He created the universe, and he's writing the story. It's a totally different level of control. History, right? We've all heard this before. History is his story. He's writing the story. God is really, 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 really in control. And so because of this, here's what this means. God is so in control that he can let things get out of control. That's how in control he is. And one of my favorite stories in the Bible, which kind of shows this, how he's so in control he can just kind of let things get out of control, is the story of Gideon. And this takes place we read about this in the book of Judges, so this is probably about 1100 BC. And the Israelites are in a battle with the Midianites. They're about to attack the Midianites, and it's the morning of the battle, and Gideon, their leader, Israelite leader, has 33,000 troops ready to go, as the Bible records it. 33,000 troops. And God's like, God's like, nah, that's too easy. Like, why would I'm not going to send 33,000 people. That's boring. That's lame. So he sends home 32,700 of the troops, ultimately, meaning he sends home 99.9% of Gideon's army. Okay? That is crazy. Right? I mean, if some general did that, you'd be like, oh my gosh, he's losing control. That's what you'd say. He's out of control. Well, that's right. It's out of control. But God is so in control that he can let things get out of control. He sends the 300, and of course, they win the battle. I love that story. God is so in control that he can let things get out of control. Here's kind of a mundane example. It's kind of a silly example, but for some reason, it works for me when I think about it. So there are two outdoor activities that I love to do the most, and that's skiing and mountain biking. Now, I'm a much better skier than I am a mountain biker because I started skiing when I was really young. I don't even remember not being able to ski, whereas mountain biking is something I've started more recently. So when I mountain bike, I'm only kind of in control. You know what I mean? Like, I'm in control, but, and like I went mountain biking this last summer in Utah, and we were going on this trail that literally goes by a cliff that drops down about 2,000 to 3,000 feet. And I basically said to myself, I'm like, okay, if this trail gets any closer than 10 feet, I'm going to have to just get off and walk because I have control, but I'm not that much in control, right? Okay. But the truth is, if I'm skiing, I can go like 30 miles an hour right up to the edge of the cliff, and I can stop. And I know I can make it might seem like, oh my gosh, look at that guy heading for the cliff. He's so out of control. But because I'm in control, I can let things kind of get out of control. You see, God is so in control that he can let you go over the cliff, and he'll still work it out. Friends, how many of you today feel like God has sent you over the cliff? God is so in control that he can let things get totally out of control. And of course, the paradigmatic example of that in the scriptures is the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus, God's representative, loses control. He's arrested. He's beaten. He's crucified. And the disciples all flee, right? Because they're like, this is out of control. But in the resurrection, we see that God is so in control, he can let things get out of control. And so in that, of course, this draws us back to our central point here. In the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we see that God uses the bad to bring about the good. He can use the loss of control, the chaos, to bring about something good that we never could have imagined. And we can rejoice in that. We can rejoice knowing that God uses the bad to bring about good. Okay, so what does this mean for us today? Let's just kind of drive it home here a little bit. For Christians, here's what this means for Christians. The glass is always half full. The glass is always half full. Christians should be the most optimistic people in the world. We got that picture here. Okay, see that glass right there? Okay, how full is that? That's half full, folks. Did you know that? That glass is half full. For Christians, the glass, honestly, how many of us, is that what your life feels like right now? Like you've just been poured out. It just feels empty. No. That glass is half full. We really should be. Christians should be the most optimistic people in the world. Or, as Peter O'Brien puts it, a New Testament scholar commenting on this exact passage we looked at today, he says this: when something bad happens, believe it is for good. That's what the death and the resurrection of Jesus drives home for us. It has changed the world in a way that now, when something bad happens, we can believe that it is for good. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting here that we ignore the horror of real hardship, okay? This is not to say that we're just to put on a pretty face and pretend, that nothing bad happens. That's not what we're saying at all. Actually, an important point that emerges here is this: true joy coexists with sorrow. True joy coexists with sorrow. And we see this. There's a passage in the book of 1 Corinthians where the Apostle Paul, again, he's talking about all this bad stuff that's happened to him, right? Like been shipwrecked and beaten and arrested and starving half the time. And he kind of ends this, after this litany of all this stuff that's happened to him. He says this: we are sorrowful, but always rejoicing. Sorrowful, but always rejoicing. So joy and sorrow can coexist if it's genuine joy. This is what's different. I talked about mundane happiness and joy. There's a difference between mundane happiness and joy, eternal joy. Mundane happiness is extinguished by sorrow. So worldly happiness that you experience through something that has happened in your life, from a worldly perspective, something positive, just a promotion, I don't know, whatever it is. Like it's just something that is you enjoy from this world and makes you happy. That kind of mundane happiness is extinguished by sorrow. The minute something terrible happens, that happiness is taken away. But the joy that comes from God, it can't be extinguished. It's like a chemical fire, A normal fire, if you throw water on it, it puts it out. That's mundane happiness. But the joy of the Lord is like a chemical fire. You throw water on a chemical fire, it can't put it out. You throw sorrow on the joy of the Lord, and it cannot put it out. And so sorrow and joy can coexist. So I don't want to minimize I don't want to minimize whatever hardships you're dealing with. You're not supposed to just pretend that's not there. The point is that in that you can see that God will use the bad to bring about good. And in that, we can rejoice. Friends, what's going on in your life today? What is the bad that you find yourself dwelling on? What is the bad that you find is stealing your joy? Friends, we can rejoice knowing that God uses the bad to bring about good. We now come to our time of communion.